Let's start with an historical observation. The very first model produced by myself and Richard Bandler was the meta model. The meta model is an absolutely clean process model. It says you can make any challenge or ask any specifying question as long as the material that you're challenging or specifying comes out of the client. So since the source of the information that you're investigating has its basis in a client's behavior, verbal and nonverbal, it's perfectly legitimate to explore that. If, on the other hand, there is an imposition of content from the side of the agent of change and then an exploration of that, the agent of change is essentially working on themselves, not on their client. Unfortunately, because of the vulnerability of most states in the change process, this will tend to drag along compliance from the client, and the client ends up adopting things which really belong to the agent of change. So the meta model is a very clear example of a pure process model. Its basis is syntax, there's no meaning involved, and it's reactive in the sense that it's a utilization of material that comes directly from the client. Anchoring, when used in an effective way, is a way of attaching handles to moving states around, and you don't have to name the states. The point of the anchor is to avoid the imposition of nomenclature, which is a conscious mind activity, and be able to move the states around effectively for purposes of separation, sorting, for purposes of integration, for purposes of arranging coordination between these states. So, again, anchoring, when used in this sense of attaching handles to things you don't investigate to understand, but you simply move them around by the use of these handles, these anchors, is a fundamentally syntactic operation, which once again avoids the imposition of interpretation and categories and in general content on the client. So those are sort of the first two big pieces, along with representational systems, that come out of the early classic codes. In representational systems, the eye movements are the behavior which you're utilizing, just as the production verbally is what you're utilizing in the meta model, and both of them have their direct source in the client. This is one way to begin to sensitize yourself to what's an imposition of content and what's a utilization of content supplied by the client. Unfortunately, in the coding that Bandler and I did, Structure of Magic, and essentially the set of books we co-authored during the 70s, which established the field. While our behavior in context was impeccable with respect to reading the nonverbal responses coming directly out of the unconscious of the client or the training group we were using, that message didn't get coded adequately. So you're left, because people now think that the point of the NLP patterns they've learned is the imposition of these process categories on the client. And they're missing the point that each such provocation, each application, stimulates a conscious and unconscious response. If you ignore the unconscious response, if you are unable, for example, to make a distinction between this, a conscious movement, and this, an unconscious movement, then you don't know what's simply an accompanying nonverbal, which supports the verbal expression, as this movement does, and which is another kind of signal which has a privileged status. It's the information directly from the unconscious of the client telling you yes in this direction, no, not in this direction, or not in this way. And, of course, incorporating that and responding with precision to these unconscious signals is a deep safeguard for the vulnerability of the client, and gives you a precise direction of it as an agent of change, which will lead to extremely successful consequences for everybody involved. With a lack of appreciation of the extra responsibility that you can take care of, take responsibility for, and effectively carry out through calibration the signals from the unconscious, people reading the books from the classic code tend to focus on the format. The format, as I've already said, is a useful lie. It's a training device to get you to know where to put your attention and then what sequence you might go through fixing your attention and that of your client. However, if you're not running in parallel a validation through the nonverbal feedback then you may be imposing huge amounts of material. And you're certainly going to run into what has been classically called resistance, which is nothing more than a special set of privileged signals in the unconscious that says either not in this direction or yeah, this direction, but not this way. In the new code, we change a number of things. For example, in the classic code, it's typical for an agent change, once a context where something is to be changed has been identified, to ask the client what they would prefer to experience in that context, what behaviors they would rather exhibit in this context, how they could behave in such a way that's more congruent with their actual resources than what presently is going on there. You're directing the question to exactly the part of the client who has the least competency in answering the question. Now, you could adopt a position that says the only function in this class of work, in these contexts, the only justification for verbal probing outside of the meta model itself, which is a process model, is to provoke a nonverbal response. Now, if you take that attitude, you are subordinating the responses consciously to the validation or invalidation signals coming out of the unconscious, and you can make this work. And in fact, this is quite typical of what Bandler and I actually did in our work, in both training and change work with clients. Because of the abuse of these impositions, even though they're process impositions, they are impositions. In the new code, we change the assignment of responsibility for selection of new behaviors, resources, etc., to the unconscious. We leave the person, the client, at the end of the intervention with the new code activity or game in a state of not knowing what new behaviors specifically they'll exhibit in this context. They know directly by experience that something enormous has shifted internally. You could ask them, without engaging in content, what the submodality differences were when they stepped into the context prior to the new code game or activity, prior to the intervention, and subsequent, and you get enormous differences, which are quite satisfying for you as an agent of change to know that something profound has occurred. You always have calibration, and this is always your first choice. And the person doesn't know until they actually re-enter the context what new behaviors will emerge. This is the deep sense of generative change. Not only will they generate those behaviors on the spot and therefore take into the nuances and the details of the actual context that they're involved in, but should they enter this context multiple times over a period of time, the responses will shift. The behavior is not fixed. The unconscious will reactivate automatically a high-performance state that's been associated with these contexts and generate new behaviors on the spot out of the high-performance state, which modify themselves automatically to take into account the nuances and the details of the actual challenging context, as well as the intention of the person carrying out these actions. So in this way, you are not turning unhappy robots into happy robots. You're turning unhappy robots into an organism which decides in context, on the spot, driven by a high-performance state activated unconsciously, what choices and new behaviors can be presented in order to satisfy the positive intentions that they enter the context with. This is a profound difference. I suspect that you could corrupt any of these things, but as presented by, certainly Inspirative, who you and Chris Jules have done an enormous amount of work of taking these intrusions from who knows where into NLP of content models, which are unethical in the deep sense we're talking about here, and finding the closest process version of what's being used to offer people the choice of continuing to use patterns that they're familiar with in a modified form, which removes the content impositions and moves it to a level of process. So just as you're able to convert content models, which are unethical, into the closest process version, it is possible for people to take process patterns and make them content. But this is a whole question about whether people have the competency and the sensibilities to detect when imposition is occurring and when not, and whether the imposition is at the level of content or at the level of process.